The death of Queen Elizabeth was a shock. She had been queen for so long that virtually nobody around could remember a previous monarch. And despite her age, she'd always been in such good health and had only declined recently. And when she went off to her favorite retreat to recover, everybody simply assumed that she would, as she always had. But she didn't. And her death represented a real risk to the realm, because unlike the death of her cousin and namesake some 419 years later, Queen Elizabeth I died without having produced a direct heir. The death and funeral of Elizabeth I, Queen of England and Ireland, deserves to be remembered. Elizabeth I was crowned at the age of 25 on January 15, 1559. She came to rule in a period of relative instability for the British monarchy, after relatively brief reigns of her half-siblings Edward VI and Mary I. Her half-sister's 5-year rule had been defined by her attempts to reverse the English Protestant Reformation. Her attempts at re-establishing Roman Catholicism had resulted in more than 280 religious executions, earning the eternal enmity of Protestant writers that described her as Bloody Mary. The Counter-Reformation had thrown suspicion at and had briefly resulted in the imprisonment of her half-sister Elizabeth. While history has a mixed view of the rule of Mary I, it is undeniable that she had become deeply unpopular by the end of her reign and, moreover, had failed to produce an heir. Elizabeth was a Protestant, and her ascension to the throne represented a significant shift in the conflict that had caused much strife in England since her father's break with the Catholic Church in 1533. Because of this, Elizabeth I's coronation has received extraordinary scholarly attention. British historian and former director of the National Portrait Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum, Roy Strong, noted in his 2005 book, Coronation, A History of Kingship and the British Monarchy, "No other royal entry has attracted as much scholarly attention as that of Elizabeth I. More and more, it has been realized to be a meticulously planned propaganda enterprise on behalf of what was expected of the incoming regime. Those who organized and wrote the pageants were Protestants." But ironically, despite a very eventful reign, the end of her rule seems to have drawn less attention from historians than the beginning did. The coronation service was representative of the ability of Elizabeth I to navigate the bitter divide between English Protestants and Catholics via the so-called Elizabethan settlement, passing various acts through Parliament that established the theology and liturgy of the Church of England while making appeals to Catholics and Lutherans. While the settlement, seen as a middle ground intended to end religious turmoil, failed ultimately to end religious disputes in the kingdom, which would become clear later during the English Civil War, it allowed Elizabeth to maintain a period of stability and ascendancy for her people. Another source of potential conflict was over who the Queen would marry, an issue made more relevant by the controversial marriage between Mary I and Philip II of Spain, a marriage that was deeply unpopular in England. Elizabeth never married, nor did she produce an heir. There are many theories as to why, but BBC Bite Size, a reference for school-aged children in the United Kingdom, notes that her refusal to marry was putting the security of England before herself. Bite Size explains, "Staying single meant that Elizabeth could keep sole control over English affairs, namely government and religion. Elizabeth had a range of suitors from different countries. Her refusal to choose between them allowed her to keep her options open in foreign affairs, whilst at the same time this enabled her to play countries off against each other, making her a strong negotiator." Royal.uk, the official website of the royal family, notes, "Elizabeth chose never to marry. If she had chosen a foreign prince, he would have drawn England into foreign policies for his own advantages, as in her sister Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. Marrying a fellow countryman could have drawn the Queen into factional infighting. Elizabeth used her marriage prospects as a political tool in foreign and domestic policies." Moreover, unlike a king, in attempting to produce an heir, a queen faced the very real threat of death in childbirth. And despite having no heir, Elizabeth steadfastly refused to name one. Again, there is speculation as to why. A 2018 article on the website History Hit speculates that, given her own experience as heir apparent, she was trying to protect a presumptive heir, telling Parliament, "I was first in line to the throne during my sister's reign, and not only is it not a good idea for that person, but it isn't a good idea for the realm. Immediately that person becomes a focus for plots." That is, if she were to name an heir, rebels would be inevitably drawn to involve that person in plots to overthrow Elizabeth. In fact, one of the most likely heirs, Mary, Queen of Scots, granddaughter of Henry VII's sister, was drawn into such a plot, leading to her execution in 1587. As with any choice to marry, naming any one of the several potential heirs could itself lead to instability and strife, and refusing to name one allowed her to play opposing sides against each other. Finally, as Bitesize says, she remained the focus of all power, since there was no apparent successor. Thus, Elizabeth managed to maintain a delicate balance in a difficult era, one which would enhance her reputation both in her own time and with future historians. As with any monarch, historians disagree over the effectiveness of her rule. To some, she was a truly great monarch whose reign took England from obscurity to world power, who ruled over a golden age of literature that included Shakespeare and Marlowe. She was remembered for maritime victories and the exploits of Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. Hourly History's 2017 publication, Queen Elizabeth, A Life from Beginning to End, concludes that a queen for 45 years, Elizabeth's reign became known as the Elizabethan era, a golden age of exploration, triumph over foreign aggressors, and relative peace that prompted the beginnings of the English Renaissance. Others portray her as being indecisive and avoiding problems rather than solving them. And over time, her reputation has gone through quite a lot of historical revision. But you cannot question that her reign was one of relative peace and stability in a time of great turmoil throughout Europe. In her last speech to Parliament on November 30th, 1601, she said, "We think ourselves most fortunately born under such a star, as we have been enabled by God's power to have saved you under our reign from foreign foes, from tyrants' rule, and from your own ruin, and do confess that we pass not so much to be a queen as to be a queen of such subjects, for whom, God is witness, without boast or vaunt, we would willingly lose our life, ere see such to perish." That she managed to save her small and isolated realm from foreign foes, from tyrants' rule, and from their own ruin is an extraordinary feat for a woman whose legitimacy and right to rule was questioned from the start, and who navigated potential division with compromise. But by any measure, Elizabeth's reign was a success only in that she was able to maintain her kingdom and her reign for some 4.5 decades at a time when the average life expectancy of an Englishman was just 41 years. But her death remains in many ways a mystery. On their website, the Royal Museums of Greenwich make a claim that many today would find startling. The cause of Elizabeth's death remains a hotly contested subject. That is, we don't even know how she died. In her later years, as friends and advisors passed away, she became withdrawn. Royal Museums Greenwich writes, towards the end of her life, Elizabeth began to suffer from bouts of melancholy, following the deaths of several of her close companions, including her long-serving lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, and former favorite, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. In November 1602, her health began to fail. A chronicle of her life, The History of the Most Renowned and Victorious Princess Elizabeth, late Queen of England, written by one William Camden, begun in 1607 and published in 1630, reads, "The Queen, which hitherto enjoyed her found health by reason of her abstinence from wine and most temperate diet, bore now in her climaterial year, to wit the 70th year of her age, began to be afflicted with some weaknesses of both health and old age, which the foulness of the weather had increased." The website Get History notes that at Christmas that year, her godson, Sir John Harrington, visited her and wrote his impressions in a letter to his wife. "Our dear Queen, my royal godmother, and this state's natural mother, doth now bear show of human infirmity." In January, Camden writes that she removed from Westminster to Richmond to enjoy quite the best help of old age. The website The Tudor Society explains, "The month is January 1603. Elizabeth is visibly unwell and in an unrecoverable state of melancholy, and has decided to retire to her favorite residence at Richmond Palace." The palace on the River Thames had been built in 1598 by her grandfather, Henry VII, after the original 12th century building was destroyed in a fire. It was a favorite residence for Elizabeth. There her health slowly failed. Camden writes, in the beginning of her sickness, her gums swelled and quickly abated again. Then her appetite, by little and little, failed her, and withal she gave herself over to melancholy. As her health failed, the question of her heir became more critical, but Hourly History notes, her Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, had been working diligently behind the scenes to pave the way for King James IV of Scotland's succession in the event of Elizabeth's death. Cecil had given advice to both Elizabeth and James that had helped to maintain their relationship, but she still refused to openly acknowledge him as her heir, Hourly History writes. If Elizabeth had been touchy about the issue of succession while still a young woman, the subject was positively taboo by now. Still, a letter she wrote to James on January 5th, 1603, that starts with, "My very good brother," and concludes with, "Proceeding from a heart that shall ever be filled with the sure affection of your loving and friendly sister, Elizabeth R.," made it clear that she supported Cecil's claim. There are at least two stories of her formal appointment of James as her heir. In one, she acknowledged by hand gesture, as by then her illness had left her unable to speak. Camden writes that she informed the Privy Council, "My throne is the throne of kings. I would not that any less should succeed me. I will that a king succeed me, and who but my nearest kinsman, the King of Scots." While Cecil took clear steps to watch other potential claimants, Elizabeth, despite producing no heir of her own and naming no heir until she was obviously dying, still managed to ensure a peaceful transition. Although Camden writes even that late announcement resulted in politics. But when the rumor was growing rife that her sickness increased, and that as she had always done before in the prime of her age, so most of all now she refused the help of all physics, it is incredible with what flying speed Puritans, Papists, and ambitious persons of all sorts, flattered and others, every one of them forward for their own hopes, posted night and day, by sea and by land, to Scotland, to adore the rising king and gain his favor. Then, Camden writes, in the beginning of March, a heavy dullness, with a forwardness familiar to old age, began to lay hold on her. A particular note was her coronation ring. Camden writes, the courtiers do also report that she commanded that the ring wherewith she had been joined as if it were in marriage to her kingdom at her inauguration, and that she had never taken off, to be filed off from her finger, for that it was grown into the flesh, that it could not be drawn off, which was taken as a sad presage, as it portended that the marriage to her kingdom, contracted by the ring, would be dissolved. Less than a week later, he continues, the 24th of March, which was the eve of the Annunciation of the Virgin, she was called out of the prison of her body into an everlasting country in heaven, most quietly, departing this life. She had both refused to see physicians and had refused to allow a post-mortem, so the actual cause of her death remains in question. The most popular theory was that she died from blood poisoning caused by her regular use of a skin whitener called Venetian ceruse that contained lead, although other suggestions are that an infection of the tonsils, which explains some of her symptoms, cancer, which might explain her quickly wasting, or pneumonia, resulting from her weakened immune system. Despite the realm suffering due to the cost of wars and bad harvest, nonetheless the website of Westminster Abbey writes, her death at Richmond Palace on 24th March 1603 was an occasion of universal mourning. She was encased in lead and placed in a wooden coffin. She first lay in state at Richmond and then was removed by a torchlit barge by night to Whitehall. The 1823 book Relics of Literature notes a poem by an unknown author held in a period manuscript. The Queen was brought by water to Whitehall. At every stroke the oars did tears let fall. More clung about the barge. Fish under water wept out their eyes of pearl, and swam blind after. The online Tudor travel guide writes that on 28th April, a little over 1 month after her death, Elizabeth's body was conveyed in a grand procession down King Street, which today is known as Whitehall, to Westminster Abbey for burial. Of her funeral procession, contemporary chronicler John Stowe wrote, Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, windows, leads, and gutters, that came out to see the obsequy, and when they beheld her statue lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. Westminster Abbey notes that the coffin, covered in purple velvet, was borne on a chariot drawn by 4 great horses with black trappers. The colored wooden funeral effigy lay on top of the coffin. The effigy is described in an 1823 work, The Progresses and Public Processions of Queen Elizabeth, purportedly drawn from original messages and scarce pamphlets. The lively picture of Her Majesty's whole body in her Parliament robes, with a crown on her head and a scepter in her hand, lying on the corpse enshrined in lead. The procession included gentlemen ushers with white rods, and a canopy over the corpse borne by 6 knights, 6 earls assistant unto the body, and on either side of the corpse 6 bannerets, carried by 12 noblemen. After a service, Elizabeth was interred in Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey. Despite the vast difference in time and situation, it's not difficult to see the similarity between that procession in 1603 and the one that we have been watching on television over the course of the last week. Despite being separated by more than 400 years, both the Queen Elizabeths were direct descendants of Henry VII, and thus were just first cousins, though 14 times removed. Both ruled for so long that the people felt as if they were a member of the family. The people remarked that using the word king instead of queen felt off. And both of their funerals were lined with mourners, weeping as had not been seen or heard in the memory of man. Their respective reigns might be judged by historians, but the mourning of their death, that belongs to the people. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.